All right, welcome to Part C. Let's take a look at the progressive era in American politics in the context of the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. All right, the progressive movement, roughly speaking, late 1890s to 1917. In some ways, it appears perhaps to be the heir of the populist movement. Populist movement dies out after 1896. Progressive movement comes on the heels of it, but the progressives are very, very, very different from the Bryan supporters. Okay, first of all, this is a bipartisan movement. There are progressives in the Democratic Party. There are progressives in the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, is considered a progressive. Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, is considered a progressive. So this is a bipartisan movement, and also unlike the Bryanites, it primarily consists of people in the cities, middle class, well-educated, they're morally earnest. What do I mean by that? Just driven by a sense of strong morality, about some sort of conviction about a particular issue. Many of these people were very religiously minded. Many of them came out of Protestantism. A more liberal Protestantism, social gospel, it's a different subject. And many of these are professionals. They're not farmers, but they're doctors, lawyers, ministers, bankers, shopkeepers, office workers, professors, middle managers, maybe lower level people in business corporations, intellectuals. Generally are the people who occupy the progressive movement. And progressives had all sorts of different views, and they emphasized many different things. They had the different causes. But on the whole, they advocated for a more activist government on all levels: federal, state, local, city, municipal. A more activist government to rule on behalf of the public interest, because there was a perception that the public interest is being left behind and private interests are running roughshod over things. And in that modern industrialization, urbanization, concentrated wealth and power has led to all of these various ills that need to be corrected, and progressives believe that the power of government ought to be used to counter those. Okay, so you had all sorts of different issues. There was a lot of concern about, for example, the integrity of elections and of local politics. And in local politics, there was, especially in urban politics, corruption was rife, fraud. All sorts of different shenanigans going on. This is a picture of Boss Tweed, who is a Democratic Party boss in New York, and thoroughly corrupt man. And so progressives had, wanted to reform things democratically. They wished to. They introduced things like referendums, direct primaries, recall, ballot reform, initiatives. Anything to increase civic participation in government. Generally, the progressives were in favor. Direct election of senators who were not presently elected by the people directly. And here's some progressives here. Like I said, they tackle many different subjects. Many progressives got behind the temperance movement. Prohibiting alcohol, that was a big progressive thing. How did that fit into progressivism? Well, alcoholism was a really big problem, and people, men would go to work long hours, get drunk, blow the paycheck, come home and beat on their kids and wives. It says, "Don't disturb the hen." It's a saloon, and it's laying eggs, poverty, murder, suicide. This is another temperance cartoon. This is a march of the brewers. The brewers, booze, booze. We make people poor. We cause poverty and crime. We are against progress. Oh, see, progressives. We rob women and children. We waste grain. And so progressives said, many, not all, many progressives said something ought to be done about this, and it eventually led to prohibition. Sometimes it also took. Oh, here's another great one: Prohibition Party taking a stab at the great octopus of the saloon industry. Eugenics was another important facet of the progressive movement. This idea using power of government to improve society, to better society, and many people, intellectuals, academics especially, bought into eugenics in the early 20th century, steering human evolution, deciding maybe who should have kids, who shouldn't. This is a new proposal for a role of government that didn't exist prior to the progressive movement, but it's also seen as moving forward. Okay, that progressive mantle forward could in this case take a very ugly turn. Progressives tended to sometimes had a very paternalistic side about them. There was a condescension toward lower people. So a progressive, for example, might want to reform the slums in the inner cities, and yet in doing so, the attitude they would have perhaps toward those people, again, sort of maybe a condescension a bit. Sometimes progressives had a problem with being a bit self-righteous and in the process sometimes even self-deceiving. Progressives coming from the professional classes placed a whole lot of faith in expert opinion and in the so-called science of the day. If we could only leave governing and public policy to experts will be able to rise above the passions of ignorant and of the ignorant and especially against the power of private interest, and experts will be able to create a better society. So expert-run government was also a big component of the progressive movement. It oftentimes was in conflict with democratic government. Many progressives were uneasy with or in some cases outright opposed to the U.S. Constitution, because the Constitution they saw as too restrictive. The Constitution doesn't allow enough flexibility for the federal government to act. Not all progressives felt that way, but a strong percentage of them did. The Constitution is outdated. It was authored over 100 years ago. That's a long time ago. And so for many progressives, it's time to move on beyond the Constitution, or bare minimum begin interpreting the Constitution in a very broad manner that gives the federal government a lot of room to work. At this time in Germany, the German universities, especially the graduate schools in Germany, were where some of the best minds were coming out of. And Sigmund Freud's at the University of Vienna. You got Nietzsche and all sorts of different thinkers coming out of Germany, and the predominant thought coming out of Germany at that time was sort of this elevation of the idea of statism and a big role for government, which more classical English schools of thought had were very skeptical of. German schools promoted the glories of a strong government, but these German schools in the progressive movement, who borrowed many of their ideas, they're not Marxist. Okay, they don't like Marxism. What they wanted was a sort of a middle way, a third way. They don't want the laissez-faire of Grover Cleveland or any of those guys. But they don't want communism and socialism either. They still want private property and social order and all the rest. And so this middle way, this harmonious middle way was trumpeted, in which a big government staffed by intellectuals, technocrats, experts, steered by interests who were knowledgeable and who understood the issues at stake. That was the kind of government that these that many of these progressives desire and seek after. Progressives were also very alarmed by the rise of monopolies and trust, which we looked at in a previous lecture. And the federal government here too should be used to counter these trusts, either by breaking them up or by regulating them. Okay, here's a cartoon of criticizing Standard Oil. I believe this is from 1904. Standard Oil. Look at the corruption. It's taken over all the private interest has taken over government, which should operate on the public interest. It's another Standard Oil cartoon. There's a big businessman just lording over Washington. This is a famous cartoon. There's the U.S. Senate. And then you have all the trusts. The private interests, the Steel Trust, the Copper Trust, Standard Oil Trust, Sugar Trust, all the different fat cats lording over the Senate. They're the true bosses. They're the bosses. They're in charge. Entrance for monopolist. Oh, we have our own bosses, don't we? Twitter, Google, Facebook. Didn't they show up to Congress pretty recently? Didn't they kind of have this attitude when they were speaking to Congress? Yeah, they did. That was an interesting series of exchanges. Not a lot of respect for our politicians, although I can't blame them, I guess. I don't have much respect for our politicians either. I'm not sure how many of the American people do. I digress. But the progressive movement says, okay, when it comes to these big monopolies or trusts, we should either use the power of government to break them up, to break up concentrated corporate power and promote competition, okay, by breaking them up. That was the manner in which Standard Oil was dealt with. Standard Oil was broken up. Or you accept the bigness and the concentration in business as inevitable. Some progressives say, actually concentration could be very good and efficient, right? Can be efficient. We just want it to work for the public interest. And so accept the bigness of the business, of the industry, but use the powers of the government to regulate it. Okay? And how do you regulate it? Well, you have government boards, you have commissions, you have regulatory agencies. The very first of these agencies was the Interstate Commerce Commission, created in 1887. But by the early 1900s, all these different regulatory agencies and commissions are founded in order to regulate big business. The problem with this method, is that big business, big industry then came in and said, okay, and in many cases captured the agencies. Okay, this is called regulatory capture, or in some areas, public choice. Regulatory capture is when big business ultimately comes in, occupies many of the most prominent positions in regulatory agencies. All right, so you want to regulate the big agro companies. Well, then in comes Monsanto and just files in and occupies the agency. You have the FDA regulate food and drug. Oh, who comes in? Right, all the big food and drug companies. Big Pharma, well, it's notorious. Big Pharma has captured many of these regulatory agencies. And so what you do is you capture it, okay, something that was intended to be for the public interest, and then you actually use it to bend the rules, mold the rules and the regulations over the industry. And in some cases, many cases, maybe even most cases, use that new agency then that you've captured to increase your own profits. Okay, and there are just so many examples of that. I can't even. I wouldn't even do. I kind of gave you one with Big Pharma, but just historically, time and time again, we see this happening where industry captures regulatory agencies and ends up working to their private benefit, and is used then to actually hurt some of their competition within that very industry. Okay. That's the big problem with that progressive response to a lot of this stuff. And This is a cartoon from the period, or later, from later, you can tell. Reforms, and then followed by corruption. Okay, corruption always seems to follow the reform. Okay, so when it came to banking, progressives go one of two ways. Okay, the old Bryan way, right? The old Bryan way, let's have it just government-run national bank, public national bank. Some progressives are on board with this. A lot of progressives would like a government-run national bank, central bank, okay? To act as a lender of last resort in times of crisis, to provide liquidity and elasticity to the currency. Or, and some of this could overlap, government-run or expert-run. Expert-run, because, well, sheesh, Congress doesn't really know that much about banking, do they? And so do we really want the national bank, a central bank controlled by Congress or by the president when he may not really understand the first thing about finance? Or do you want a central bank run by experts? Oh, that looks a little more attractive to many progressives. Well, who are the experts in finance? Well, next time we will see. And in the movement toward banking reform, this is the system. It's been in place now for 50 years. 50 years. Panic in 1873. Panic in 1893. Next time it'll be a new panic. Panic of 1907. And a panic of 1907 will lead to this cry for banking reform, and they'll get it. See you next time for the Federal Reserve Act.